right. I want to go ahead and get started now, so if I can have everybody's attention, that'd be great. My name is Paul Harrell. I'm a state rep from Attleboro, and first thing I want to do is recognize a couple other legislators who are in the room. We have Sean O'Connell, who's from Taunton. We have Denise Provo from Somerville, and is there anybody else represented here? No, is there? Oh, I missed it. Okay, so I'm Paul Harrell from Attleboro, and just to tell you guys a little bit about my interest in this and why I brought this together today. I used to work in jail in Philadelphia, and I worked in the mass prison system at Masters in Criminology. And if I leave politics, it's to go back and get my PhD in criminology. So this is something that's been near and dear to me. I published about 20 articles on sex offenders, either in local newspapers or in the Huffington Post. And there are a lot of myths surrounding sex offenders and what works. And in particular, though, we're talking about juvenile sex offenders today. And so, especially with respect to the registries. And this is something that there's very intense passions on both sides of the issue. We should get tougher, we should be a little more smart, we should be a little more scientific, we should let the parents decide, how things unfold. There's like opinions are wide and varied as many as there are people. So basically what we have is a couple folks who are going to be talking about the issue of juveniles being on sex offender registry. And so what we're first going to do is speak for about 25 minutes or so. We have two speakers, and they've worked together in the past. We have diversity of opinion, but they actually do agree on what we're trying to get at as well. So first they're going to introduce themselves because their backgrounds are long and detailed and in-depth about this topic and their involvement in it. And so we'll start first with Nicole Pittman, and then she's going to introduce Eli. And so, Nicole will give biography, and then Eli will give his. Then Eli's going to go ahead and start by, giving a presentation, and then he'll turn it over to Nicole. And then after that, probably about a half hour from now, 25 minutes from now, we'll start with some questions and answers and go from there. So, Nicole, Eli,
thank you very much. Thank you, Representative Hume. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited that so many people turned out. Just quickly about my background, I basically work as a national, resource on, I've been working 11 years now on just juvenile registration. And I started as a public defender, so I work on reforming juvenile sex offender registration laws. And what I really call it is youth registration reform. And what it's actually turned out to be is starting off saying, why are we doing this, to actually joining up with really fantastic people, mostly a lot from the survivor communities around the country, and because really saying what are effective policies to end child sexual abuse. We all want to end child sexual abuse. And a lot of my work started moving into that direction when I went around the country in 2011, 2012, and 2013 with Human Rights Watch, interviewing 500 people that went on the registry as juveniles, and really finding out what their trajectory was, with their everything from the beginning to where they were. I ended up interviewing mostly about people that were in their 30s and 40s that went on the registry when they were 8 years old, 9 years old, 12 years old, and also interviewing their victims, which were usually a sibling, a relative, a family member, and finding out what the registry meant to them. So a lot of the work that we're doing here today, that we're talking about, is a compilation of that. I've been lucky to work for the past 2 years with Eli Lair of Arch Street Institute, and the president and founder of Arch Street Institute. And as he'll tell you more about his background, as a conservative Republican, he's been a very great help. We go into many states, we go on the national level, federal level, and we'll talk a little bit about our work. I think it's going to be, and I'll just turn it over to Eli to talk about his background.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that introduction. And yeah, my knuckles are quite ragged on the ground. I don't quite have horns growing out of my head, but I am indeed a right-wing Republican in the Massachusetts State House. Work for the Heritage Foundation, Republican Majority Leader. If you're a state legislator, I'm a longtime advisor to Alec. I'm a really scary guy. It's been my great pleasure to work with my friend Nicole. Basically, I'm a lifelong member of the vast right-wing conspiracy, and I run a pregnant that deals with right-wing stuff. So we're talking today about preserving safety and protecting youth. These are two hugely important things. The point of what we're doing here today is not necessarily compassion, although it is compassion. It's not necessarily a matter of being more effective, although it's that too. The ultimate thing here is protecting youth and making us safe. Those are my goals, and that is the purpose of the criminal justice system. This is me, right now. So today we'll be going over 4 things. First, we'll be talking a little bit about juvenile justice in general in Massachusetts. Second, why we include children on the sex offender registries. Then I'll be handing things over to my good friend Nicole to talk about the human costs, and solutions that might be pursued in Massachusetts and elsewhere in the country. So, let's talk about juvenile justice. Children. That's where it starts. I love South Park. That is the finest TV show ever. But we are talking about children. That is our topic today, children, kids. I'm a father myself. This is my son, Andrew. He's a fantastic kid, just turned 10. I'm doing this as a father from my own perspective. So, should we ever really come down hard on juveniles? Is harsh punishment ever the correct thing to do to juveniles? Are there juveniles who deserve to be treated harshly? Well, my answer is, yeah, there is.
Justin Bieber for you who are not Generation X.
Actually, it's a bad example. The truth is that, yes, and yeah, I couldn't think of anything redeeming about it, so yeah, it really is awful. His penalties for the fact he was a celebrity are probably steeper than somebody else would have gotten for the same offenses. It was to make an example. And it's delayed his ability to tour, that actually helps a whole lot. So that is, but when it comes down to it, there are a few things that every parent, I bet a very large number of people in this room are parents, and many more want to be parents. Kids are not fully developed, impulsive, hormonal. Kids do dumb stuff. That's what it comes down to. Historically, though, we've realized this. We have a separate juvenile justice system for the very particular reason that kids, when they screw up, and kids do screw up, kids will screw up, get a fresh start. That's why we have a separate system for juveniles. This hasn't always existed, but all 50 states do have it today, and that's the point of having a juvenile justice system. So, if we have a separate system that gives children a fresh start, why do we include children on sex offender registries here in Massachusetts or elsewhere in the country? Good question. Well, the quick answer is the Adam Walsh Act of 2006 created incentives, not absolute mandates, but strong incentives for states to include juveniles on sex offender registries. Some people, particularly on the left, have said this was a panic about super predators. Actually, looking at the evidence on that, the idea that there was some sort of great moral panic and everybody was afraid of kids, that really isn't borne out by the evidence. In fact, if you look at the legislative history of it, and I know the legislative history because I was personally there working for the Senate majority at the time that Walsh Act passed. The truth is, more like these guys were doing our thinking for us. We were not thinking. This was largely a matter of just, oh, let's do this. I don't know. It seems like an okay idea. Now, juveniles, it's important to note, we're talking only about juveniles who are tried and adjudicated in juvenile court. People who are adjudicated in juvenile court. This is not a matter of, say, a 17-year-old who commits a violent rape. In 49 states, Massachusetts one of them, there is a way to try that person in the adult system. And in my judgment, that is perfectly appropriate for this hypothetical 17-year-old. That is a small, very small number of sex offenders who are juveniles, and we have a system for the reason for this. These are people who we decide are to be tried in the juvenile system that we're talking about. This is what it looks like. Most states register, 40 states in America, have youth registration and so forth. Now, they did a lot of cost-benefit analysis about this. Here's what they found. Actually, I lied. They didn't do any cost-benefit analysis. This slide explains it. Yeah, and here's a list of the law enforcement officials and police chiefs who testified in favor of doing it. There weren't many. And some states go well beyond the out-of-law shaft, which at least requires a relatively serious conduct. In some states, a kid who goes streaking can get put on a sex offender register. Going streaking, unpassing a classmate, things that are dumb. Sending a nude selfie to a boyfriend or girlfriend. These are dumb things. These are things kids should not do. They should not have lifelong penalties. And they get Massachusetts is among them. Juveniles can be required to register here. There are things without an obvious sexual component, like kidnapping, that require registration. Laws, in many cases, don't take the offender's age into account, which can be enormously relevant. A 17-year-old who has a sexual relationship with a 14-year-old consensually, that's probably not a healthy event. I don't think it's criminal. Now, this also, I should mention, is something that, for a state with a fantastic record on LGBT issues, should be considered a dark side. In fact, this is done wrong. The practice of registration is particularly hard on LGBT youth. This isn't necessarily because of the way the laws are written, although there may be laws in some states that do it, but rather just social attitudes. And until we have a totally equal attitude on the part of all parents throughout the entire country, the mere fact of these laws is going to impact LGBT youth the most and the most seriously. Now, through our street has done the cost-benefit analysis, which wasn't done before. We had the head of the Society for Cost-Benefit Analysis, along with our research staff, look at this. Here's what we found. The cost-benefit is 80 to 1. There are some benefits, but for every $1 in benefit you get to society, you pay $80 in other costs. 80 to 1. That is the ratio. That is the economic ratio of child sex offender registration. The costs of notification, this is just notification, are enormous. This is where there's a public registry. This is more than just having law enforcement. Interestingly, the single biggest costs are in the neighbors of people. It hurts home values tremendously and does nothing to improve public safety. Notification, per se, of child sex offenders. Notifying it because there are basically no cases of this happening with people who did it while they were a child. Sex offenders, primarily, this is a general chart, but something important to remember, family members are a majority of sex offenders. People who are known to the victim make up the next largest point, and total strangers are a small minority. Now, this does not mean that all registration is a bad idea. I personally think registration is a good idea and should continue in many cases, but not for children. It does not make sense for children. Registration, as I said, does have public safety benefits when applied to adults. The literature is not totally clear, but it's good enough to say this is probably something we should continue. And correlations between the beginning of registration and declines in these offenses are pretty darn strong. But the data on juveniles do not support any of it. At the very best, if you make every possible assumption that juvenile sex offenders are just the worst people ever, you might be able to find some way of proving that it's even. And while you're doing this, you're undermining the entire purpose, the entire reason for which we have a separate juvenile justice system. This is a bad idea. I have some ideas of similar policies. Notification is bad, and there's a similar policy. burning one. That's pretty close to what you're getting when you register juveniles. It is a bad idea. It is bad public policy. It's bad not only because it's cruel, not only because it's unjust, not only because it doesn't do any good, but because it is simply a waste of taxpayer resources. It does not make us safer. The costs are vastly higher than the benefits, and it's deeply inconsistent with the purpose of justice. We do need reform. And with that, I'm pleased to hand this over to my excellent friend, the top advocate in this area, Nicole Packman.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Eli. And I'm going to make sure. Thank you. I'm going to make sure that I finish so that we can have at least 10, so about 2:20, so we can have at least 10 minutes of questions and answers. So I'm just going to go through these. And one thing, a couple of things with the human cost that I wanted to talk about. That when we talk about the human cost, it was really who are the children on registries, and who are the people that are, and who are the other people affected by registries. Most kids, as we know, and especially kids that are kept in the juvenile justice system, the offenses are happening in the home with a classmate or the neighborhood. And so when we think about putting kids on a registry where everyone in the world can see, what are we doing in the home to actually prevent it from happening again, and what are we doing in the home to actually get healing done, to stop that cycle? And so that's where, when we think about kids on the registry, we do think about the 17-year-olds and the 18-year-olds. Those kids are going to the adult system. So who are the kids that we mostly see in the juvenile justice system? One of the stories is Bobby. This is very much a typical story of the 500 cases that I've interviewed. This is him 2 years before he was arrested for indecent exposure. And he actually was playing with some friends in the neighborhood. They were so excited. All of these kids, they were so excited their parents were going to go to a party. So they were going to be babysat by a 13-year-old. So it was about 12 to 15 kids from ages 6 to 12 that were going to be, a 13-year-old was going to be in charge. Bobby is a class clown, and he always likes to get a laugh. And so around the time when it was close to eating dinner, the babysitter said, let's play a game. I'm so tired of you all. They went in the basement. It was a dark basement, turn off the lights. She said, everybody take your clothes off and then try to get dressed, and whoever's not dressed the most, we're gonna laugh at. Again, this is what Eli's talking about, brain development. I will never understand this story because I'm not a juvenile, I'm not a child. It's a stupid game. But this is the game they played. Bobby decided, I'm gonna take my clothes off and not put them on. The lights went on, Bobby was naked. So when the parents came to get their kids, the 6-year-old was sleeping, some of the other ones, and the mother of the 6-year-old picked her up, put her in the car, and she said, Mommy, I saw Bobby's penis. The mother floored her to the police station. She found out the next day what happened, went back to the police station and said, I'm sorry, I found out what happened, it was a game. They said, ma'am, we can proceed without the victim, we don't thank you for coming. The case ensued. Bobby was adjudicated delinquent in juvenile court of indecent exposure. And it was aggravated because his victim was a 6-year-old. And he went to the juvenile justice system from the age of 11 until 18, where he received juvenile sex offender treatment every single day. Where he woke up and said, I'll be a sex offender, I'll be a sex offender for the rest of my life. Which is an archaic way of treatment, but we still have some treatment that is really based on kids doing that. He was going to so much treatment in the juvenile facility that he wasn't able to get his GED. So when he was released, he had to register as a sex offender at the age of 18, no GED, and he was told you can't live anywhere with kids under the age of 18 because you're a registered sex offender. All of his family members had kids, his parents had grandkids in the house, couldn't find a place to live. That's actually in most states. If you're a registered sex offender and you don't have a place to live, it's called a failure to register, which is a felony conviction, servable by 2 to 6 years in prison. Bobby didn't have an address, he was homeless. 2 years in prison for this failure to register. He got out, he knew less people. There were more kids involved in family members' lives. He got a second felony conviction, failure to register, because he couldn't find a place to live. So that's 4 years in prison, adult prison. Same thing happened a third time. He's got 3 felony convictions on his record. It's about the time when I met him. When he was in prison, he met a woman, a pen pal, they got married, so he had a place to live this time. with 3 felony convictions on his record. And when I met him, I was writing the report up, and we interviewed and talked to him, and met his wife and his family, and he kept calling me around Thanksgiving of 2012. And he kept saying, I don't feel like I'm supporting my wife, we keep getting evicted, our house got set on fire, she wants to have kids, I can't live with kids, I can't, all of these things. I found out that he got arrested for receipt of stolen goods, and I went down for that hearing. And the judge said, because you are a career criminal, I am maxing you out to 15 years in the state penitentiary. And said you are a repeat offender, and because of his felony failure to register. This is Bobby in 2015 when I went down to see him in prison. This is what's happening to many of our kids. They get out, they have technical violation after technical violation. One of the failure to register can be if you change your image. Of course, we don't want somebody that preys on children to change their image without somebody notifying. But when you think about a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old that grows facial hair, if he doesn't go re-register, get a new picture within 3 days, it's a failure to register violation. It's a felony. So we're also adding to our mass incarceration problem with these technical violations. So how many people? We have almost 900,000 people on our registry in the United States. It is at a critical mass. It's at a point where we can't filter out who is a Bobby and who is somebody that actually is preying on children. And it's got so bad in certain states that states have been sued for failure to protect children or people because there are too many people for anyone to monitor. So we're talking about really how do we reduce the number of people on the registry. So some of the things we look at are how many studies have shown that it's important or effective to have kids on the registry. There's 0 studies in the 20 years, since 1994 is when we've been registering as a country. There's 0 studies. The annual cost of registering youth is $3 billion. And I'll talk a little bit about how we are using all of that on the back end, and we could be using a lot of that for prevention, stopping offenses before they happen. The rate of recidivism among youth who commit sexual harm. There's a new study that just came out last year. Recidivism of children to commit another sex offense, whether they're on a registry or not. Because we have 10 states that don't register children who never have. It's about 2.75. Where most instances in the juvenile justice system, burglary, harming somebody, 50 to 60% recidivism rate. For kids that commit sex offenses, it's about 2.75. However, this is the only time in juvenile court that we allow punishment and consequences to rise beyond their juvenile years into their life. The other thing that I'll talk a little bit about before I get to this slide is people say in Massachusetts we do it a little bit better because we don't put them on a public most likely, and it's also 20 years for kids most times. It doesn't matter, which I found out, there's no such thing as non-public. In this day and age, we have Facebook, we have Twitter, they can't go to certain places. Everybody knows who's on the registry, especially with a child, a young person. And the other thing is you never really get off of the registry, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So 20 years is the same thing as lifetime. So one of the things that came out in the past year and a half after doing the report raised on the registry was one of the samples I asked, or one of the questions, how many were you in the child welfare system before you went on the registry? Meaning, were you a victim, established victim in the child welfare system? It doesn't have to be sexual abuse, neglect, abuse, maybe not enough food in your home, and there was an established petition opened up. Turns out that 100% of the 500 people that I interviewed were in the child welfare system within a year before they went on the registry. And so that really starts to make you think, where are there some traumatic events or some issues where we can come in and intervene? And how are we thinking about children where they no longer cease to be victims? Because we turn all of that off. And Bobby spends every day saying, I'm a sex offender, I'll be a sex offender for the rest of my life. Where was the treatment about his victimology? So, as Eli talked about, we have 40 states that register children. It's interesting because Massachusetts is a very interesting place in the country because their neighbors, every single neighbor has historically never registered kids, including New York, including in Pennsylvania, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. They still don't register children. And what we're starting to do is a little study. We've done a study of a couple states. States that have never registered children, the recidivism rate is about 1%, where the national rate is 2.75%. So we actually could do more effective things if we use treatment and not registration. So some of the reasons why we want to talk about not putting kids on the registry, and then I'll get to, so I want to make sure we're finished. What came out of the Raised on the Registry report are psychological harm. Psychological harm. 20% of the kids that I interviewed attempted to commit suicide due to being on the registry. And these are kids that got out earlier than Bobby, that were 14 or 15 and had to try to navigate not being able to go to school because they're on a registry, not being able to go to a park. And this also went to some of their victims because it also affects their siblings in many ways. They live in the same house often. Exposure to violence. So if you think about Bobby, he's now, when he gets out, he'll be in his 40s, almost 50s. And his offense does say indecent exposure, victim under the age of 10. You're going to see a 40-year-old man, and you're going to think that Bobby did this when he was 40 and not 11. And so those are things that we really have to think about. Family harm, because this is happening within the home. Barriers to employment, barriers to education, housing instability, economic issues. So one young woman who I interviewed who was a victim when she was 12 and her brother was 14 and he harmed her. She said, what I want lawmakers to understand is that when you put a child on the registry, you're putting a family on the registry and also a victim on the registry. My house was burnt down because everyone saw his address. And so we have to start thinking about what are some solutions. And so I'm going to skip through very quickly just to talk about reallocating of resources. So if we're spending $3 million, where could we be using that since it's after harm occurred? Where could we be using that to the front end? So a quick example that I'm going to end with is California, which I'm working on now where I live, just for the past 2 years. I'm from the East Coast. California's lifetime, everybody's lifetime since they began registering juveniles in 1986, but adults in 1945. Everyone is lifetime. So what is happening in what we're looking at with just children in California, this is very similar to other states and Massachusetts as well. We're looking at racial disparities that happen. In California, a black male, a black boy, is 7.5 times more likely to be placed on the registry for life than another child with the same offense. Because when we talk about risk factors, we don't have a very good sense of that. And we also, sometimes the biases come in. And so when we think about that, the other thing, this is about the disparity, the thing that's really important, it's not as bad here in Massachusetts, but it's something we would love to work on. In California, we are spending $140 million to register just kids. And this year, in the budget, they can only put aside $46,000 for prevention. So think about if we change those numbers and we could use those resources to stop child sexual harm before it happens, instead of using it on the back end. And those are some of the things that we would love to start talking about and to shift the paradigm. I want to kind of wrap it up because I want to really save time for questions. Let me just see if we go through a couple things. One thing I want to talk about is there's a big momentum to getting rid of youth registration. Basically, the Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice, which has a representative from Massachusetts, just issued these recommendations where registration should not be extended to anyone under 18. And that was given to Obama and the federal government, that was. And so that's basically where I want to stop, and I want us to do some questions. I'm going to move this. Move to some questions.
So I'd like to thank Eli and Nicole. There was a list of bills that I've filed that speak to this issue, and I've worked on these bills with the Public Defenders Association, CPCS. And so did everybody get one of these sheets when you came in? Maybe they were being passed around, but basically there's 5 different bills on here. And so if these are things that you guys are interested in supporting, we have time for testimony, that would be great. But before we go into the questions, I also worked with kids. I told you guys I worked in jail and prison for 7 years between 1996 and 2003. I worked with 5 to 12-year-old kids at the Arbor YMCA, and then I also did a little work in Los Angeles. And at the time, when I was working with kids, it's what I wanted to do with my career, is work with kids. And my mother gave me a plaque, which I still have, and that says it's easier to build a child than repair an adult. And that's kind of what the work that you guys are advocating is for right now. So with that little plug for my plaque, my mom gave me, and the bills that I filed with CPCS, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. And yeah, John.
Thank you for the presentation. So I know you talked about the entire country, but since we're here in Massachusetts, it seems kind of relevant to talk about what's actually happening here. And I'm just wondering if you know how many juveniles are on the sex offender registry here.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so one of the things that we did is we actually we tried to find out. We were told that the state administrator of the registry doesn't have the breakout for juveniles, which is not, what's that, they do, you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, that's what we were told, and so we weren't able to get that number.
Oh, so there's 4 juveniles on the sex offender registry in Massachusetts. Just to kind of put it in perspective that it may not be as big of a problem in Massachusetts as it might be in the state, which is much larger, like California. So that's why I think it's important to talk about what are the actual numbers in Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, if a juvenile is convicted of a sex offense, is the judge able to relieve them of their duty to register as a sex offender?
And convicted, you mean in juvenile, adjudicated delinquent in juvenile court?
Right.
And so there are, somebody probably has a better sense of, if that's okay. Did you?
Yeah.
About
Go ahead and just identify yourself and go ahead and make your comment.
Barbara Kagan, I was the Director of Juvenile Appeals for CPCS. I'm theoretically retired now. First of all, the number of juveniles on the sex offender registry is much higher than 4.
Not
What they
according to
don't-
the sex offender registry board. So, I mean,
Well,
maybe
I
there's
know
some
that I've
there.
represented more than 4 juveniles who are juveniles at the time of the crime, who are on the registry right now. So I'd love to compare data with you. We've been asking for that data for years and have never been able to get it from the registry. But I can tell you, I've represented more than 4, so that's the first thing. Second thing is, yes, in Massachusetts, a judge can relieve a juvenile of the obligation to register. Usually there's a hearing, usually experts come in and testify whether they think that juvenile is a risk for recidivism. And a lot of the time what we find is that in fact that juvenile, A, was a victim, frequently in the child welfare system himself or herself, or it was, what we used, I'm trying to think of the phrase we used to use when I was growing up, where we were, sort of basically playing, okay, but touching each other, exploring, doing things that are inappropriate that we wouldn't want children to do, but that didn't have the same intent as an adult who perps a child, okay? It's a totally different phenomenon. And so what we find is that, in fact, many juveniles get charged and have lifelong consequences in Massachusetts for behaviors that basically are very different in kind than what we are concerned about. When we're talking about public safety, we're not talking about the overwhelming majority of juveniles. Let me also make another comment. In states where someone who's 8 or 9 are basically adjudicated delinquent for a sex offense, that's incredibly egregious. In Massachusetts, if you're 7 or older, you can be charged in Massachusetts as a delinquent, and you can be adjudicated delinquent for a felony or misdemeanor. But let me point out that overwhelmingly what we know in Massachusetts and across the country is that children 12 or younger are really not legally competent to stand trial or to tender a plea. So the fact that a kid is adjudicated delinquent and they really didn't even understand the proceeding that they were involved in is an egregious wrong. And that happens on a daily basis in Massachusetts and across the country.
We had one more comment, and then I'll go ahead and start with questions again.
So I believe my question was already just answered, but I just wanted to be sure. When you say there are only 4 juveniles currently on the sex offender registry, you're talking about current juveniles, not those who were adjudicated as juveniles and theoretically turned 18 yesterday and now on juveniles, correct?
Yeah, juveniles who are on the sex offender.
So do you know how many were adjudicated and put on the registry as juveniles currently?
That's actually a problem from state to state. And the problem is that a lot of times that we're trying to figure out on the federal level is that they don't have a special code to say who is a juvenile. They just put everybody as a conviction. So you have to really look at who's under the age of 18 at this moment to get a snapshot, but you don't know who like the Bobby is, who spent, most of our kids are spending 4 to 5 to 6 years in treatment. and that's an inpatient, sometimes facility, and then they get out and are registering. And so they might be adults. And so it's really hard to figure out who went on as a juvenile. It's a state to state issue.
Or, I would also say that even if it were only 4, that's 4 too many. It's 4 kids whose lives.
But keep in mind that judges can relieve them of their duty to register right then and there, which, often happens. And so if you're on the sex offender registry in Massachusetts and you're a juvenile, you had to have committed a crime against, a sex crime that a judge would not relieve you of your duty for.
If somebody has committed a crime that severe, my judgment, and my friend Nicole is not a written section 7, so I'm speaking only for myself, but my judgment is that if somebody has really committed a crime that's that severe, they ought to be adjudicated in the adult system, where there are more rights for the accused and more severe punishments. If it really is that serious a crime, if you're imposing a potentially lifelong sanction in the juvenile justice system with many fewer rights for the accused, that just isn't fair or just.
So we had another comment. Could you identify yourself this time?
Paul Denal, Research Director of the House Judiciary. Just wanted to clarify. So you said judges have the ability to no longer allow a juvenile to register. You said that's happened many times. Do you have a rate or an idea of how often that happens?
We would like to get that information, but it's very difficult
So
for them to compile that
the
information.
many times?
But, well, one thing, there's 4 juveniles on the sex offender registry.
So is this coming from, the SOAB or anyone else where this information is coming from?
Judges have the ability to relieve juveniles of their obligation to register right then and there when they're sentenced, or they can get a new hearing every single year to ask to be relieved of that duty to register as well.
But there are no numbers as to how often this happens, correct?
I don't have those. Oftentimes it's hard to get those particular numbers.
So,
But we're saying that there's a lot of juveniles that are convicted, which I think you said in your presentation, and there's not that many registered at one.
Well, what I was actually saying is that, so juvenile adjudication, and convicted is adult court. Adjudicated delinquent is not a conviction in juvenile court. And so you could have, which I think it's closer to, in the hundreds or thousands of kids that went on the registry as kids. But they're only showing up, if you look right now, as 4 kids. They're all over the age of 18, because you're only looking at birthdays. And so that's the problem. The other thing is when we talk about discretion with judges, we run into that racial disparity issue. Because, and I'm not saying that there's a bias, but we run into somebody using their decision about that versus what should happen with everybody. So one thing I just would think that's really interesting, if there's 4 kids right now that are under the age of 18 on the registry, why are we spending so much money on a registry system for juveniles instead of putting that into the juvenile?
That's a good question. I don't know how much we spend for juveniles,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
if it is in fact
Right.
more, it doesn't seem like it
Yeah.
would be that much.
So we have another comment. Could you identify yourself also, please?
Marnie Levy from the Committee for Public Counsel. I was just going to clarify this issue of number of juveniles on the registry, which I think we've already talked about, but just to make sure everybody's clear, that when somebody is classified in Massachusetts, they may be a juvenile, or for a juvenile adjudication. They may be a juvenile, or they could be an adult, a young adult, who has a juvenile adjudication on their record. And the 4 juveniles on the registry only account for the individuals who are juveniles today, but in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 10 years, 15 years, 19 years, they're still going to be on the registry, but they will no longer be juveniles. So I wanted to make sure that was clear.
Does anybody have another question? Yeah, Paul, can you identify yourself? if you'd like?
Representative, this is
Oh, Paul.
Paul Shannon from Criminal Justice Policy Coalition. I would like at some point for you, Representative Haro, to kind of briefly say what these bills would do, just so that we'd kind of be clear on that as we try to build support for these bills to take care of this problem.
Okay, very good. Yep. We'll do that before the end. Any other questions, anybody? Yes, could you identify yourself and who you're with?
Roz Windsor with the Criminal Justice Policy Coalition. Nicole, your last slide was about something from the Department of Justice. Could you just give that citation more fully, or just what that was?
Absolutely. That was actually, it was, that's the wrong way. That was actually, sorry.
Go ahead, you can touch it. If you know how to do it, go ahead.
I'll go on and tell you. That was actually a recommendation to the Department of Justice by the Federal Advisory Commission on Juvenile Justice, which is made up of a representative from each state that get together and look at the way juvenile justice laws apply and policies. And so over years, they've been looking at the research, which a lot of the research, I haven't talked to them myself, but their new recommendation that came out in 2016 that was given to the administration, the White House, the Department of Justice, and members of Congress, was that registration shouldn't apply to anyone under the age of 18 in the United States. So that would be the Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice, and that's actually on their website, this recommendation.
Yes, ma'am. Could you identify yourself as well?
Carol Tierney, and also with the Criminal Justice Policy Coalition. Could you say a little about how the Adam Walsh Act might prevent some of these changes because of the stringent rules of their?
States lose burn money. Basically, states lose money that would be provided for local law enforcement uses. Now, there's a whole range of things they have to do to come into compliance with that. And that's only one of them. And the amount of money lost isn't that large. And there are some arguments, and you can still get the money if you don't. It's just one factor. But you lose some federal funding.
But by removing juveniles from the registry, would that
That by
be a
itself,
consequence?
if that was the only thing, if that was the only change you made, it would be highly unlikely that that alone would result in the state losing money. Although it could happen.
So Massachusetts is not in compliance with the Adam Walsh Act right now, and so just to start, because the Adam Walsh Act does give a very small amount of offenses that need to be registrable. So there are 25, 30 registrable offenses, I believe, in Massachusetts. They can probably be cut down to about 5 or 6, and Massachusetts would be in compliance or something close to that. So even trying to come into compliance with the federal law would be an improvement for Massachusetts, to be honest.
Yes, ma'am.
Chris Hazen with Child Advocacy Program at Harvard Law School. Nicole, can you talk a little bit more about what you mean when you say that the 20-year maximum here in Massachusetts is really a lifetime sentence?
Yeah, good question. And most people are saying, oh, we only allow 5 years, and really 1 day for a child on the registry, is that it's like, you can't unring the bell. And for most of our kids, in your household, in your neighborhood, they know you as a registered sex offender. And so something that's, I think this might be an interesting thing to say, the suicide rate for kids has happened when they've actually gotten off of the registry. And that's because we have kids that are thinking, oh, when I get to this day after 10 years or 20 years, things are going to be completely different. You walk outside your door, and somebody's still spray painted your garage. Somebody still knows that you're on the registry. You can't unring the bell. We have private companies that get that information, whether it's public or not, that information is out there. So today, if you actually Google somebody that's on a private registry, you will probably get their information, because the private companies can get information that's not public. And so home facts, Offendex, real estate companies actually purchase this information, and it's Google searchable all the time, whether a child's private or public. And you can never get a child off the registry or a person. So once they go on, it's for life.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We talk a lot about sealing or expunging records here, but even if we did pass some legislation here in Massachusetts that would expunge a record with a Corey, you still have the arrest record, and police are not going to give that up at the police stations. You still have the court record, which is public information. That's not going to be giving up. I used to work in jail, and I worked in prison as an administrator. I know we're not going to give up the jail or prison records either. So, and then you have all this information which is consumed by and sold by the private companies. And so sealing or expunging records, it's almost a false sense of hope. I mean, we should still do that for some certain crimes and cases, but it's really loaded with problems and lots of hurdles every step of the way.
Can I just Bobby, there was actually an attempt, because he didn't have counsel for his case, to remove his adjudication. However, he would still have 3 felony convictions saying failure to register. And so that's indicative of if he goes for a job, somebody's like, oh, this guy was on the registry. So, and most of our kids have 3 to 4 to 5 felony convictions for failure to register. It's commonplace for our kids.
So, any other questions? No. You guys may have seen I've been recording this. It's a 45-minute video so far. I'm going to put this on YouTube, so all of the facts and figures and everything, you guys can go ahead and grab those, and I'll put this on my public Facebook page so you guys can take this and circulate it if you want. So anyway, and no other questions then at the moment? No? Oh, Paul, go ahead.
Just, Nicole, or either of you, do you know, what are the crimes in Massachusetts that would put someone who commits a sex offense under the age of 18 on the registry?
We have the public defender. If you can't answer that, I know these guys, this group right here probably could, not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot.
Well, there's, how many, I don't know, 50, 100, no, there aren't 100, but there's, I'd have to sit and count, but there are, every offense that is listed as a sex offense in the statute would be applicable to juveniles, almost all of them. So, it's
So that would,
no exception for juveniles. Juveniles don't have less exposure than adults.
So one thing that's on the books, I believe the governor might be looking at is the sexting, to try to make an exception, because right now, we have a 14-year-old, not Massachusetts, but Minnesota. If you send a picture to a 14-year-old and that picture is intercepted, basically that's distribution of child pornography, which is a registrable offense. Those are happening, and the problem is when we have same-age kids and we're treating them as if it's a 50-year-old doing something with a 14-year-old. And that's the problem with all of our offenses here in Massachusetts as well. We just don't look at the fact that it's a child.
one of the values of having Nicole speak is that doing the national work that she does, looking at different states, we can also learn what not to do in other states, what direction we don't want to go down, because you see all the consequences in some of the places you've worked in, so you're going to...
Just to clarify that question, does consensual sexuality between underage, where one of the partners is underage, does that put you on the registry in Massachusetts?
If it's before, if it's a certain age difference, yes.
Yes.
It is, right. It is, yes, it can be.
A child under the age of 16 cannot consent. So therefore, if the boy is 16 and the girl is 14, and the parents find out they've had sexual contact, and they bring the charges, the boy is going to be charged even though it was consensual, and it would be a registrable offense.
Very good. I've attended a lot of legislative briefings before, and this has actually been one of the ones that is the quietest and most solemn, and just I think people are just focused the most on it. I mean, this has been great. So, any other questions or anything? No. All right, I'm going to go ahead and
explain your bills.
yeah, I can do that. Let me shut this off.